So let's get started. Why do policies matter? If you've got policies, it really does help to streamline board discussions, especially when you're in a situation where things can potentially get heated or controversial. And if you've got a policy to govern something, then you've already made it happen beforehand. The board just has to refer to the policy, so it saves time. It also saves stress and conflict, because when you're in the middle of a challenging situation, the last thing you want to be doing is trying to deal with that situation and trying to work your way around creating a policy at the same time. So all of that helps to reduce stress. It helps you to stop from wasting board time. And it also helps you to reduce legal risk. Because if you've got policies that sets things out very, very clearly as to what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, there's less chance you're going to find directors or even members are going to end up in a situation where there is legal risk to the association. So it helps to reduce your legal risk. And it also means good governance. So those are the things why policies really matter. What we're going to talk about today in terms of the agenda, I'm going to start off by giving you a real life example. And this is something that happened to me not that long ago. And it just made me feel so grateful that the policy was actually there, because it just made things so much more simple than would have been the case otherwise. I'm going to talk to you about how to use policies effectively. I'm going to give you the anatomy of a good policy. What should a good policy look like? What should its structure look like? We're going to talk about how many policies you should have and which ones you should have. I'm going to give you some tips for do's and don'ts. I'm going to tell you about how you can get real value from the process of creating policies. It's not just about the outcome. And then we'll talk about what the key policies are. What must you have and what should you have? So let's start with an example. As I said, this is a real life example. And the situation is this. There was an association, let's call it Association A, and they were the only association in their space. So in other words, they had no competition at that moment in time. And Shelley, let's call her Shelley. Shelley was a director of Association A. A good director, had always been a good director, lots of industry experience. So what happened was a rival group of people in the industry decided that Association A really wasn't giving them what they wanted. So they were going to set up their own association in direct competition. And so they started a nascent board of directors, really there to help recruit. And they started actively trying to recruit the members of Association A. Now, so far, no harm, no foul. This is all fair and completely legitimate. Where we started running into a difficulty was the group B asked Shelley to be on their board of directors. And Shelley said yes. So once the board of Association A found out that Shelley was now on the board of the rival group, they called conflict of interest. And Shelley did not believe there was any conflict of interest there at all. Shelley's view of the situation was, well, it's better for me to be on the board because then at least I know what's going on. I can share that information with Association A. In other words, kind of said all the wrong things. But Shelley was absolutely convinced that there was no conflict of interest involved at all here. Well, fortunately for this association, they had a very explicit conflict of interest policy. And in that conflict of interest policy, it said very clearly that it is a conflict of interest if you sit on a board where there are material differences between how the boards might be approaching things, or there could be a situation where the interests of those two boards might be in conflict. It was very clear there in the policy. And once this was pointed out to Shelley and the policy was reiterated to Shelley, it was very clear to Shelley as well, too. So Shelley decided to resign from the rival group, and everything proceeded as it should. Now, you could imagine, given Shelley's conviction that Shelley wasn't doing anything that was a conflict, if there had not been a conflict of interest policy, at the very least, it would have been a protracted and probably, stressful and potentially confrontational discussion. But as it was, it worked out very simply. This had been done a long time ago. In fact, Shelley had been involved in approving the conflict of interest policy. So it just made things a whole lot simpler than might have been the case. So that's a good example of why you want to have good policies and to make sure you really thought them through and got the whole board engaged in putting them together. Now, one of the things that we often see is that policies are created and then it's kind of, well, we've got that knocked off. We don't really need to do anything now that we've got those policies. It's really important that all of your board of directors, and by the way, I'm talking about board policies here. What we're going to be talking about today are not specifically operational policies. These are things that you need as well too, and they're really a separate bucket. What you want to make sure with your board policies is that all your directors are trained on the board policies and that they've explicitly signed off in their training that, yes, I'm aware of the policies, I've got them, and I've signed off on them. What you want to make sure as well is, in addition to training them, and I prefer live training for this, that they also have a board reference package, and all the policies are in the board reference package, and that this is easily accessed. If you give a board member a 3-ring binder and they've got to find that whenever they're looking for a policy, that's probably not the best way to do things. Make sure that you've got an easy link that they can use to get to the policies, so that even in a board meeting, they can quickly reference them, refresh their memories on them, and be ready to make an informed decision. What I also encourage you to do is that anytime you have an agenda item where a board policy might help to making a decision on that agenda item, include that policy in the board package, so that when the agenda item comes around, you can say, by the way, we might need to refer to this board policy. Here it is in your package. So you're actually using the board policies in a really appropriate day-to-day way to help the board make decisions. Also, make sure an important part of using policies effectively is making sure they're up to date. So don't just put them away in the policy folder and that's good to go forever. Make sure that you're reviewing them, and I suggest reviewing them annually. Now, this is something that everybody needs to be involved in. I do suggest you delegate it to a board committee, so the board committee can look at the policies and make a decision to recommend to the board whether they need changes or not, and if so, what those changes might be. If you have an executive committee, that might be a good committee to use for that, or any group that's interested in being part of that. But keep in mind, they're just there to make a recommendation to the board. You want to make sure that it goes back to the board, and the board has a fulsome discussion. Does this policy still fit? Is it still relevant? Do we want to accept the changes that are recommended by the committee? Now, if you do everything all at once, you're going to find that the board gets fatigued judging them, and you might find that by the time you get to the last policy, it's just not getting the attention it deserves. So when I say review them annually, I do mean that, but try not to do it all at once, or you'll just find, like I said, not all of them get the attention they deserve. So have a schedule. Maybe every quarter you're going to tackle 1 or 2 policies, get those reviewed, and then move on to the next one in the next quarter. So make sure that you're giving yourselves ample time and brain attention to make sure that you're reviewing them appropriately. Now, I want to talk to you about the anatomy of a good policy. What we want to make sure with a good policy is that we've got certain elements that are in that policy. You want to start off with a purpose. Why do we have this policy? How is it intended to be used? What are the circumstances in which you want to consult this policy? So be very clear in very plain English. Why do we have this? And what is the purpose of having it? Then what you want to make sure is that you've got a definition. Now, if you're talking about conflict of interest, for example, you need to define what conflict of interest is. Be very explicit about what conflict of interest is. If it's an accessibility policy, what kind of accessibility are you talking about here? So by the time we get through these 2 things, we know what the purpose is of the policy, and we've clearly defined what we're talking about here. We don't want to have a conflict of interest policy that says, make sure that you don't end up in a conflict of interest, because if that's not defined, it's almost worse than not having a policy at all. Once you've got your purpose and your definition, now note, what is the responsibility of individual directors, the board, the association, or potentially all 3? Who's got responsibility here? What is their responsibility? Now, depending on the nature of the policy, it might be appropriate to have an action and or a remedy in the event that this policy has to be called into action. So, for example, if a conflict of interest is identified as being a nascent conflict of interest or a clear, full-blown conflict of interest, what is the action and the remedy that needs to be taken there? And if you do need an action and a remedy, I strongly recommend that you have a process. So it's very clear to everybody, if we find ourselves in this situation, this is the responsibility of the board and or the individual directors. Here's the action that we're going to take in order to remedy this. And here is exactly how the process works. I can't tell you how much easier that will make a potentially stressful situation than having all those things laid out. And it makes it very clear to everybody who's involved. This is not something that we just came up with yesterday. This is something that the board has approved. You yourself may be involved in approving this policy. Now let's follow it. It's there for this particular situation. So that's your anatomy of a good policy. I encourage you to use that whenever you're putting a policy together. Now, how many should you have? This is an important question. And, you know, one thing I've seen happen on more than one occasion is we try to make sure we've got policies to cover every single eventuality. The problem is that becomes overload from a management perspective. If you've got too many policies, it can be hard to find the right one in the right circumstances. And there is also the potentiality that you're going to get overlap between policies. So you have to change a policy in one policy, and then because there's overlap, you've got to change another policy as well too. So make sure that you're careful to make sure you've got the right number of policies, but not too many and not too few. So this is kind of the Goldilocks principle: not too many, not too few. You want to make sure you've got just the right number of policies. Make sure that you've separated them by type. So again, don't have overlap. Make sure that each policy is very specific for a very specific kind of situation, and then you can keep them short. You don't want a policy that goes on for pages and pages, because people just won't be able to use it in an appropriate manner because it's too long and it's too complicated. I recommend that you don't have more than a page for the policy, and that page is done in a clearly readable font. So we're not talking about Arial 08 font here. We're looking at something that we can easily read online as well as printed out as well too. So make sure you got the right number of policies. If you're going to err on the side of having too few at the beginning, because as you go on and start using your policy, you will probably find that you need more, but wait until you see the appropriate time to pursue that policy, because as you're drafting that policy, you've got to have a really good sense in your mind as to how you're going to use this. And if you're just trying to kind of cover the waterfront ahead of time, it may not be the right time to put that policy in place. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to give you a few do's and don'ts, and I'm going to start with the don'ts. First of all, I often hear association executives saying, "Hey, has anyone got a policy that we're looking for this kind of a policy? Can you send us, what your template is?" And there's no harm in that. There's no harm in asking other association executives what they're using and getting an idea of what that looks like. But please don't use the opportunity to copy and paste. You really need something that's there for you and has been especially created for you as an association with your unique needs. Second thing you don't want to do is don't wait until there's a problem. Don't wait until you've got a conflict of interest to put together a conflict of interest policy. Don't wait until you've got a director code of conduct policy before you put one in place. We talked earlier about not having too many and not having too few. Another thing you don't want to do is don't write them and then shelve them. This isn't something that just goes into your library. This is something that you want to use on a daily basis to help the board make effective decisions and to deal with issues before they get out of control. The other thing is, don't do it all at once. If you don't have any policies right now, you want to take it one at a time, so the board can genuinely put their thoughts and their efforts into making sure this is a really good policy. If you try to get the board to review 6 policies and discuss them effectively, it's never going to happen in a single board meeting. There's policies that just won't get the attention that they deserve. Now, what you want to make sure that you're doing is making sure that you've got the board engaged. This isn't just a question of handing the board something that's basically a fait accompli and say, "Please vote on this." You want the board to have a thorough and fulsome discussion on your policies. I do encourage you to get advice. Get advice from a professional. Have them talk to you about what your board really needs. What are the issues and challenges that you're dealing with the board? I encourage you to get advice. I know that finances may be an issue. This doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be something where you're necessarily getting an external professional to write them for you. If you can, and if you can afford that, that's a good start, but don't use that as an excuse for not getting the board involved in the details of what's actually in that policy. When you're trying to decide which policies that you want, look back. Think about what are the issues that we've had happen to this organization in the past where a policy might have helped. So look back in history, think about what the issues are that you've had in the past where a policy might have been able to mitigate the problems that occurred. Look ahead. Think about what issues could happen with this organization and what do we want to have a policy in place for to help avoid those things from happening. We talked earlier about keeping them short and about reviewing them annually. So those are some do's and don'ts you want to keep on top of. Now let's talk about getting value from the process. I mentioned earlier that the process is as valuable as the outcome. If you get the board involved in having a real good discussion about each policy you're putting in place, you're basically forcing the board to have important and strategic conversations, because these board policies are big picture things. They're there to help the board do a good job of governance, and having them get involved in those important and strategic conversations is really super valuable. So this isn't just something that you're doing because you have to do it. You're doing it because this is a great opportunity to get the board having those higher level strategic governance oriented conversations. So this is why you don't want to beg, borrow, or steal somebody else's policy. You want to make sure that what you've got is specific to your association. I can't tell you how valuable it is to get the board really rolling up their sleeves and getting down into the meat of a policy and figuring out why we're doing this and how we're going to use that. One part of that conversation should be, let's have some scenarios here. What if this happened? What if this happened? What if this happened? Does our policy cover all of those eventualities? Now, what I want to talk about first is, what are the policies that you really must have? Now, this is my opinion based on my experience as both a governance expert and consultant over the last many years, and also in my experience as an executive director. I can see it from both sides, how you might use it and how you need it for governance, for good governance. My opinion on the board policies you must have are executive limitations. In other words, defining what is delegated and what is not delegated to the executive director or the CEO. How we account for material commitments, who makes those decisions. Conflict of interest, really, really important. If you're a trade or an industry association, you want to make sure you've got an anti-competition policy. And you also want to make sure that you've got a confidentiality and director conduct policy. So this will help you make sure that directors understand what's expected of them in board meetings and outside of board meetings. Material commitments will make sure that you know who can spend what under what circumstances. So let's talk about executive limitations first. Let's make sure that, first of all, remember when you're constructing this, look at the anatomy that you're looking at of an effective policy. So make sure it's constructed on the basis of the anatomy. So we want the purpose, we want the definition, we want the director and or board and or association responsibility with respect to that policy. And maybe we need an action and a remedy if we end up in this situation. And if we have an action and a remedy, you probably want to have the process in there as well too. So with respect to executive limitations, the reason why you've got this, a lot of organizations struggle with the difference between what is governance, what is operations. What should we be leaving the CEO to do on their own? This is why we pay them the big bucks. This is what they're there to do. Versus this is what the board should get involved in. So the reason why you want to have an executive limitations policy is to make it very clear to the CEO and the board that this, within this area, all is delegated to the CEO. Outside of this area, this is the area, these are the lines that the executive director or the CEO cannot cross. So the what for this policy is really, this is a policy that is all about do not. This policy will make it very clear the CEO or the executive director must not cross these lines. So what you're doing in this is defining the boundaries. These are the boundaries of the CEO's delegation. Within these boundaries, everything within that boundary is delegated to the CEO. So if ever there's a question where the board's saying, well, we think we should be involved in this discussion, the executive limitations policy should help the board and the CEO to say, well, no, actually, the board shouldn't be involved in this discussion, or, wow, yes, the board should be involved in this discussion, but only up to this point. So in terms of governance versus operations, a good way of looking at it is the board is responsible for the what, the CEO is responsible for the how. So if it's how, it's governance. If it's operations, if it's what, it's governance. So let's talk about the first one in the must-haves, material commitments. Sorry, the second one in the must-haves, material commitments. The reason why we want to have this is that we've got very clear, explicit, and manageable delegation on our financial decisions. We don't want anyone to be in any doubt about who is authorized to make financial decisions and for how much. You want this explicitly laid out. This will save controversy, and it'll definitely save challenging situations between the CEO and the board. What we want in that policy is, what are the dollar amounts that are delegated and to whom and under what circumstances? Now, keep in mind, when you're delegating a dollar value, you want to make sure that you're looking at that dollar value over the full length of the commitment of that material commitment. So for example, if you're entering into a multi-year contract, that might be for rent, it might be with a contractor, multi-year contract, add up the total amount over those multi-years of that contract, and that is the material commitment that you're entering into. So it's not just what it is for the first year or the first tranche, it's the entire material commitment that's going to be in that contract. Now, in terms of the dollar amounts, one common way of delegating to the CEO is if you've got a budget, which you should, and if the board has approved it, which they should, then if it's within the budget and there's no kind of unusual complications related to that decision, it should probably be delegated to the CEO. It's in the budget, the board's already approved it, we know what the line item is, there's no complicating or unusual factors here, just let the CEO go ahead and do their thing. Now, if it's outside of the budget, you might want to escalate it to a committee or some of the officers or even to the board itself. So sometimes you're going to want to delegate that. You certainly want to delegate it if it's outside of the budget and it is a material amount. And by the way, in your material commitments, you're going to define what material commitments are. If it ends up going to the board, it's going to be something that is not only at X budget, but it is a big decision. Now, this might be because there's a lot of dollars involved. You know, maybe the board has approved the budget, but there's a line item in there that is super huge and it's a really big deal. So in that case, when it comes time to pick the vendor, perhaps, if that's what's happening, or some of the high level details, you may want at least the executive committee or the board involved in that. So when you're putting your material commitments together, if you've got that done well, everyone will know when something needs to be pushed upstairs for a decision and what are the things that can be delegated exclusively to the CEO. Now let's talk about conflict of interest. The why of the conflict of interest is to get ahead of a problem, to make sure that you've got explicit clarity ahead of time. I can tell you that every time I've seen a conflict of interest develop, the person who is in the conflict of interest absolutely, truly believes that they are not in a conflict of interest situation. I've never seen someone get into a conflict of interest where they honestly thought they were in a conflict of interest position and they were just trying to push the limits. They, for the most part, invariably believe that everything's okay. So there is no consensus on common sense. We all think it's common sense, and when it happens, everybody says, well, why? Of course, everyone knows they should never have done that, but that's rarely the case. So common sense, as you know, needs to be made explicit. So we want clarity in that conflict of interest. Make sure your definition is really, really clear. Now, what kind of stuff do we want in there? Well, we want to define what is a conflict of interest in the event that you have a direct or indirect interest in a vendor or supplier to the association. A direct or indirect connection with a staffer. You know, maybe somebody's niece or nephew is employed by the organization. Maybe there's an opportunity for staff or directors to be able to use association resources for personal use. At what point does that become a conflict? What about the seeking or receiving of benefits from vendors or suppliers when they end up doing business with the organization? We want to make sure that those and any other things that you could think of that could potentially be a conflict for your association are explicitly dealt with in that conflict of interest policy. Now, in the case of a conflict of interest, you want to make sure that you've got a remedy and a process. Remember the situation that we talked about earlier where one of the directors had chosen to join a rival board and there was a conflict of interest policy in place. The board identified that there was at least a perceived conflict of interest, and then there was a process that had to happen from that. Now, in this case, the remedy was for that director to step down from the second board, which meant the issue was rectified immediately. Now, if it was a situation where it wasn't necessary for the director to step down from one board or the other, but maybe the director just had the potential to be in a conflict of interest because they had a potential vested interest in what was going on with the compensation, the hiring of a staffer, or maybe the use of a particular director or supplier, you want to make sure that that director is recused entirely from everything related to both the discussion and the vote. Now, I have seen situations where, let's call them Shelley, feels that it's entirely appropriate for her to be involved in the discussion because Shelley feels she has valuable input to contribute to the discussion. Shelley's okay with being recused from the vote, but feels she should be part of the discussion. I really urge you to make sure that Shelley is recused entirely from the discussion as well, because Shelley has the ability to influence the discussion by being part of it. And if Shelley has influenced the discussion, then Shelley has effectively influenced the vote, and we don't want that. I mean, let's face it, we want the board to make the right decisions on staff, on vendors, all that kind of stuff. And I'm confident the board will. The last thing the board wants to have happen is they made the right decision on the vendor or the staffer, and then somebody comes back later and says the process was flawed. So now it's debatable whether that was the right staffer or the vendor, and that debate has only happened because we didn't have a good process to make sure there was no appearance of conflict at all. So in this case, with this particular policy, you want to make sure you've got a remedy and a process in there. Now let's talk about anti-competition. Why do we want to have an anti-competition policy? Keep in mind that if you're an industry or a trade association, you are bound by the Competition Act. So you want to make sure you've got a policy to make sure that you are making sure that your directors and all of your members are aware. Make sure that they understand what the legal risk here. The legal risks are quite substantial. And also keep in mind that if you do have an anti-competition policy, it can be helpful in a couple of instances. First of all, have an excerpt from it that you can recite before any board and committee meetings. It just means you're automatically reminding people of what is not acceptable. And it means you're not having to read the entire act before a board or a committee meeting. It means you are referring to it, you're reminding them of it, and you're making sure that at every instance where there's the possibility to have collusion, you've made sure that everybody has been aware of it ahead of time. Now, keep in mind, especially in the US right now, where always litigation is a big concern, there are organizations right now that even though they may allow their members to attend a conference, in some cases, they don't even allow them to attend the social and networking events at the conference because they're concerned they might be accused of collusion later. We've also got situations where some associations simply won't allow their employees to sit on a board of directors. And if you are demonstrating as an association, you've got a good, strong policy and you are enforcing it, you're going to make it easier to be able to recruit directors from companies that are concerned about this kind of thing. So it's good to have just for good governance. It's good to have for legal risk mitigation, and it may also help you with recruitment of directors. Now let's talk about confidentiality and director conduct. This is basically what you're expecting from your directors. You want to make sure in the why are we doing this, that every director understands what their responsibility is as a director. You can't expect them to guess at this. You want to make it very clear what you're expecting from them. And also, again, like conflict of interest, often common sense is not shared by everybody on the board. Everyone's got a different idea about what common sense is. So make sure you got it stated very clearly. So what you're looking for in this particular policy is what is the role of the director? What are we expecting from them? That might be hours, it might be committee work. It certainly should be attendance. You want to make sure that directors understand that they are expected to attend all board meetings. And in the unlikely event that they may have a conflict that they just can't get out of, that they can't attend a board meeting, that at what point does this become an issue where they've got to step down? Is that 2 board meetings in a row? Is it 3 board meetings in a row? How many board meetings do you have in a year? If you only have 4 board meetings a year, 2 or 3 board meetings in a row, they've missed half of the board meetings for the organization. So make sure that what you've got there is something relevant in terms of your attendance expectations. You know, from a confidentiality perspective, make sure that it's very clear that anything that is said in the boardroom does not leave the boardroom. The only thing that comes out of the boardroom that is outward facing is the minutes. And keep in mind with the minutes, you want to make sure that you're not attributing comments to individuals on the board of directors. I don't want to come out of a board of directors meeting and have the minutes say, Aaron said such and such, and then Bob said such and such. You can bring up what was mentioned from a big picture perspective so that it's clear there was a fulsome discussion, but please don't attribute it. If that's in the if that's in the minutes, then you're obviating the whole idea of confidentiality within a board meeting. And you want to make sure directors feel comfortable raising issues and saying, well, what about this? What about that? If they feel they're muzzled because it's going to come out that they specifically said something, you're going to get a much poorer level of dialogue. Make sure that also in this particular policy, it's clear who has the ability to speak on behalf of the organization. You don't want every member of the board of directors to be a de facto spokesperson for the board. You want to make it clear that the only people that speak on behalf of the organization are, for example, the CEO and the chair. Those might be the two spokespeople. Maybe it's just the chair, maybe it's just the CEO, but you want to make sure that directors understand they individually are not spokespeople for the organization unless specifically and explicitly delegated. The other thing you probably want to have in here, it is a legality that if you're on the board of directors, then only you can vote at a board of directors meeting. I often hear individual directors saying, oh, I can't make that meeting, so one of my colleagues is going to come and sit in my stead. No, that is not okay. If the board agrees, one of your colleagues may be able to sit as a guest just so that they can hear the dialogue and be there to potentially report back to their colleague, but they cannot vote on your behalf. As a director, the members voted in you to vote on their behalf. They did not vote in your colleague. So that's not good from a legality perspective. It just can't be done. Secondly, keep in mind, if you bring in your colleague, they don't have the benefit of past history, being on the board, having the training, all that kind of stuff. They've just been parachuted in. They don't have the knowledge and the ability to vote effectively. So for all sorts of reasons, legal and otherwise, there is no proxy for a director vote. Terms of termination, it should also be clear in this particular policy what the terms are, what is going to make a director be terminated immediately, and not going through a member vote, but if this happens, this director is going to be terminated immediately. Make sure that you're on top of your bylaws and on the act as well too, so that anything that says immediate termination of a director is compliant with both your bylaws and the act. So those are the policies that you really must have. What we have here in terms of must-haves are conflict of interest. We've got anti-competition. We've got confidentiality and director conduct, and we've got material commitments. So what are the should-haves? I really encourage you to have a policy for your operating surplus. So this is a policy around, this is the amount of money we want to have in the bank to protect the organization's financial sustainability. That's what we're looking for in an operating surplus, is an actual guiding rule about how much money we want to have in the bank and potentially how we're going to get there. Operating surplus and accessibility. Accessibility is a good should have as well too. I mean, after all, accessibility is a legality, and depending on how you run your organization, accessibility may or may not be particularly relevant to you. But if you have any kind of activities where people are physically showing up in person at an activity, you certainly don't want to go without that kind of policy. You also want to have a member code of conduct as well too. You want to make sure that it's very clear what you're expecting from your members. This is going to be important if you find a situation where a member is behaving like a bad actor. And I really do encourage you to have a board nominations policy. This can really be helpful. So let's start with the operating surplus. What do we want to have in our operating surplus? The reason for having an operating surplus is that so you've got money in the bank in case we have an economic downturn, we have a loss of members, so that we don't immediately have to shut down operations or immediately curtail operations. We've got some money in the bank to keep the doors open, to keep providing member services, even if we've got a temporary downturn. We've also got some money in the bank in the event that we need to make an investment in the future. Maybe at some point, we're going to have to spend a good chunk of money on legal counsel. Maybe we're going to have to spend a good chunk of money on investing in software or some type of technology that we need for the future. We need money in the bank in order to handle that. Now, I often hear, you know what, if we've got money in the bank, the CRA is going to take away our not-for-profit status. That is not true. We do know from CRA audits that have been taking place over significantly, much more over the last 10 years, that I've not seen a single organization lose their not-for-profit status because they had money in the bank. However, you do need to make sure that if you've got money in the bank, you've got a reason for it. So when you've got an operating surplus, make sure you designate on your balance sheet, this is our operating surplus, this is what it's there for. So it's very clear if you ever get audited, this is the amount of money that we've got in the bank, and this is why we've got that money. Now, how much that is, I've seen organizations get audited with 12 months of operating surplus in the bank without getting so much as a finger wrapping or a slap on the wrist. So the CRA doesn't have any rules around that, at least not any that they've ever identified to us, and there is no CRA ruling on that. But what you want to do here is to make sure that it's specified in months, so that as your budget gets bigger or smaller, you don't have to adjust your operating surplus. It's always going to be how many months of wiggle room do we have if we end up in a challenging situation or we need to make a major investment. So let's talk about accessibility. Let's keep in mind there is legislation around this. There is the Accessibility Canada Act. And as of 2024, any organizations with 10 employees or more must publish what their plan is. So keep in mind, regardless of whether accessibility is particularly relevant to you or not, or you think it is, that act imposes certain obligations on larger organizations. The reason why you want to have it is you want to make sure that you're mitigating your legal risk. And by ensuring awareness, you're mitigating your legal risk by making sure that everybody is aware what you need to do from an accessibility perspective. I also encourage you to have a member code of conduct. Now, there's a reason for doing this. The credibility of the association can be badly impacted if you've got people that are part of your membership or companies that are part of your membership that are behaving in an inappropriate manner. So in order to protect your brand, to protect your credibility, keep in mind, especially if you're doing advocacy, this is something that you really need to be on top of. Once somebody becomes a member, you need to have a means for managing their behavior. And if you can't manage their behavior in an appropriate manner, you need a way of terminating them from membership. So what you want to have in here is very clear terms of membership. In order to keep your membership, this is what has to happen. And here's our expectations of you as a member. What we're going to have in that member code of conduct is legal adherence for sure. You want to make sure in your code of conduct that every member is adhering to rules, regulations, and legalities. And you want to have some elements of basic professionalism in there. You don't want people running around, walking into other companies' premises and trying to, recruit everybody that's on scene. You want to make sure that they're not publicly slandering other companies or other professionals. Just have some basic professionalism in there, because keep in mind, just like common sense, basic professionalism, people's perceptions of that are not necessarily common or equal. You also want to make sure in your member code of conduct that there is a remedy or a process. So if we end up in a situation where there's a complaint about a member, or the board itself observes that something is just not quite right with a member, we want to know in that policy, what is the role of the board? When we have a situation occur, what is the board's job? In there, you also want to have notification. So if it's the board's job to conduct an investigation, you want to make sure that the person, the member or the company that's being investigated is entitled to notification. The board has received a complaint. The board is investigating. Here's your notification. Here's the nature of the complaint. And here's how long the board has to conduct their notification. This is what the board's obligation is to you as a member. Here's what the board has to share with you. This is your opportunity to defend and the timing that you've got to make your defense. And then what's the timing for the board to come back on their final ruling? I do encourage you, subject to legislation and bylaws, to make it clear in this policy that it is the board's final decision, that the board ultimately has the final say on whether this is a yes or no to termination for that particular member. You probably want to have something in there as well. If a member is terminated, is there an opportunity for them to take a timeout and then potentially come back and reapply again? Is that a possibility? If you feel that that is appropriate and you want to give them a timeout of a year or two or something along those lines, make sure that's specified in the process. And what is the process to come back again? Do they have to go through a more rigorous process than another new member, or is there something special for them? Now, I do want to talk about board nominations. I really feel this is a really important policy to have. Often, one of the things that leads to a decline of associations is a board that just doesn't change. We've got the same people or the same groups of people over and over on the board, and this leads to a perception that other people, other members are not welcome. You want to make sure that everybody, every member understands that everyone is welcome to be on the board, provided that they meet certain standards and certain expectations, that this is open to all members. What we want here is we want effective recruitment. And in order to have effective recruitment, we need to have transparency. And in order to have transparency, we need a nominations policy that says how nominations are going to be conducted. So in terms of the what, we want to make sure that we made it clear that we're going to strike a nominations committee, what the role is of the nominations committee, and what is the process that the nominations committee is going to follow when we are doing an outreach for new board nominees. You want to make sure that the policy covers what is the submissions process? How does someone apply? What are the expectations of people applying? Is it just saying, I put my hand up? Or are there certain things that have to be in the nominations form? Definitely encourage you to have a nominations form that makes it clear what you're looking for. And then what is the selection process? In addition to what you're asking for on the form, and let's say on the form, you're asking for a brief biography. What is their experience in the profession or the industry? What is their role? What are their previous roles? And why are they interested in a position on the board? Those might be the basic questions you're asking them. What happens next? Well, you want the nominations committee to at least review the submissions that have come through. And in the event, and hopefully you're going to be in this fortunate position where you've got more nominees than you've got positions on the board, you're going to be able to make a short list. And from the short list, you're going to make a recommendation to the board. The board will then make a decision on the slate of directors. And from there, it goes to a member vote. Now, let's talk about interviews. Unless you have hundreds of nominations for your board positions, I really encourage you to give everyone an interview. I encourage you to make your short list after you've done your review. Do your review. The nominations committee is going to have some opinions about who might rise to the top of the heap, but give everybody the courtesy of an interview. You know, if you've got 3 people, you've got 6 applications, you've got 3 opportunities for board positions, interview all 6. It's a courtesy. And you also might learn something from that interview that you don't know from the bio or the reason that they've given for their interest. And it also means if you're wanting to make sure that everybody understands that it is truly a transparent process, making sure they have an interview makes them feel like they were heard, that they weren't just dismissed because they weren't somebody that the board knew, that they've had the interview, they've had a chance to express themselves. And then if you don't choose somebody, go back to them and say, hey, George, thanks so much for your nomination. The board has decided to go with another candidate, but here's why they decided they were going to go with another candidate over you. And maybe what it is you haven't been involved in any committees so far. We haven't had a chance to work with you in any way, shape, or form. So please get involved in some committees so the board has a chance to see you in action. So in other words, give them some direction as to what's going to make it more likely that they will get nominated next time. It also gives them some encouragement. Yes, I've been heard. Yes, I am valued. And yes, I will be considered in the future. Here's the things I need to do to make myself more board ready. So those are the policies that I really encourage you that are must-haves, and I really encourage you or should haves. There's all sorts of other policies that may be highly relevant to your organization, but when you're trying to decide where to start from, or if you're looking to enhance what you've got already, have a look at these policies and consider them. So in summary, policy tips, make them personal. This isn't something that you just want to copy and paste from another organization. Make sure the board is engaged. Make sure the board is having a detailed, structured governance discussion about every single policy, and make sure they've got the time to do it and don't overload them with too many policies at once. Think back. What are circumstances that have happened in the past where you would have been really fortunate to have a policy, and think ahead to other circumstances. And when you create that policy, do a test drive on it. Here's my policy. Okay, what if this happened? What if this happened? What if this happened? Is that all covered for explicitly in the policy? Now you know you've got something that's thorough and is going to work for you. And make sure that you've got a process to ensure compliance. You don't want to just have those policies sitting on a shelf. Make sure that all of your relevant policies, anytime you've got an agenda discussion where a policy is relevant, make sure that policy or policies are included in the board package. Also, don't wait until there's a problem. Make sure that you've thought ahead. Most of the things that you're going to need a policy for, you can anticipate. It's rare that you've got a policy that covers a particularly obscure situation, but you might see that coming, and that's the time to put the policy together. Don't wait until it happens. Make sure that you're reviewing and refining your policies annually. The board is discussing them and voting on them. But again, don't overload them. Don't review all your policies at once and put them all in front of the board in a consent agenda. You want discussion. And keep in mind, as any new issues come up, think about, is it appropriate to have a policy for this? Is it covered elsewhere? Is it not covered elsewhere? Keep it simple and keep it explicit. If you'd like some help, talk to us about our policy review package. We can help you review the policies you've got and help you decide whether you need new policies, whether you need anything replaced, or maybe you need to get rid of some of your policies. Keep it clean in order to keep it effective. So that concludes the formal part of the presentation. What I'd like to do now is open it up to Q&A. Kevin, I believe we have some questions.
Thank you, Erin. Yes, we do. So first question, operational policies versus governance. How do we make the determination which policies fall into which categories, and how do we respect those lines of delineation?
Okay, that's an excellent point. I had said at the beginning of this conversation that I'm focusing on board policies, and there's no black and white about what actually is a board policy versus not a board policy. It's really what it ends up governing. So it's a good question. You want to make sure that it's very clearly defined in your purpose. This is a board policy or this is an operational policy. So as a general rule of thumb, and I know this is an issue for all of us, you know, where is that gray area? Where is it governance or is it operations? As a general rule of thumb, if you've got an executive limitations policy, this really helps, because the executive limitations policy says, here's the lines that the CEO cannot cross, and anything inside that is operations and is delegated to the CEO. So when you put together an executive limitations policy, it's going to help you to define what is governance and what is operations. And that could be a good starting point for the rest of your policies.
All right, awesome. Thank you for the clarification, Erin. Second question is, how do you keep the board focused on strategy when operating policies need to be approved by the board according to the CNCA?
Right. Okay. So you're talking about the federal not-for-profit legislation. And what I think I hear you saying is, you know, the board needs to approve these operational policies, but if they're going to get down into the weeds and start discussing them, does that mean they're getting down into the weeds of what the CEO is supposed to be doing? Yeah, that really is a balancing act. You want to make sure that the board has approved the policy so that we know these are board sanctioned policies, but they are operationally and they are to be run by the CEO, and they are telling the CEO and the staff how they want them to operate. So you just need to decide what level of discussion is appropriate for a board policy, what level of discussion is appropriate for an operational policy, and make sure that the board and the CEO are very clear on what level of discussion is appropriate there. So get that sorted out in advance before you actually discuss your operational policy, because for sure, the natural tendency of the board is going to be getting down into the nitty-gritty, and because they're going to be doing that with board policies. So decide in advance what is an appropriate level of discussion for an operational policy, then bring it to the board.
Right, great step-by-step guide there, Erin. So third question, I believe you addressed it, but I just wanted to ask in case you wanted to speak a bit more on it. So this question is, we are in the midst of incorporating our association. So what are some of the bare minimum policies that we will need?
Yeah, thanks. Again, good question. And I would encourage you to look at the must-haves that I suggested, especially as you're a new organization. I would not only encourage you to look at the must-haves, so don't go overboard, but also keep in mind that, you know, as the association evolves, if you're starting with a new organization, you don't necessarily know what's going to happen as you go forward. So what you need to do is you need to make sure that you review those policies after they've been in place for about a year and maybe even 6 months, because you might find as the board evolves, your policies, while it was the right policy, maybe you're missing things that need to be added. So make sure that those early policies are reviewed at appropriate intervals, and maybe even more frequently in the first year than just annually.
All right, awesome. So fourth question is, are there any model formats for a policy that you could share?
Yes, I would encourage you to look at the anatomy part of this slide, where we talked about we want to make sure that we've got a purpose, we want a definition, we want to know what the role and responsibility is of individual directors, for the board, for the association. should there be a process? Should there be a remedy? And how does that actually work? So what I would suggest for that as a model format, use the anatomy of what should be in a policy. And from that, it's actually pretty easy to put it together. Put together your basics, follow that anatomy, and then go back and trial it in real life. Think about the issues that have happened over the course of the last number of years, the issues that you can anticipate. What if this happened? Okay, let's go look at the policy. Does it cover it? And if you've got all of the conceivable scenarios that you think might happen and they're covered by that policy, stop. You don't need to put anything more in it. You've done a test drive, you've followed the anatomy, you've got everything in there that you think you need in it. The test drive has proven that you don't need anything more. Stop there and you're probably good.
All right. So fifth question is, how do you feel about policies in place for members and volunteers with regards to AI and how it can be used?
Okay, well, let's start with policies for members and volunteers to start off with, because that's kind of the bigger picture. Yes, I absolutely do agree. You should have policies in place for members and volunteers. So you want a code of conduct, as we talked earlier, for members. You know, what is the requirement in order to remain a member of the organization? This is important for your credibility as an organization, and for volunteers as well too. You might choose to use exactly the same code of conduct and confidentiality rule for your other volunteers as you do for the board of directors, or you might want to have a slightly different one for the committees. There are things that are more relevant for the board of directors perhaps than for committees. I mean, the confidentiality issue may not be as much of an issue for committee work, depending on what the committee is. I mean, nominations would clearly be an exemption to that. But you might want to consider having committee volunteers be a separate code of conduct. Or maybe you can just use the one that you're already using for the board of directors. Now, related to AI, really what you need to be doing here is going back to the basics. Okay, what could happen in the future with respect to AI where we're going to wish we had a policy to govern it? And that's really what you want to think about. What is the potential future? What are the implications of AI for our board, for our association? And what do we want to get out ahead of? It might be right now that we think we're going to want to get out ahead of it, but we're just not sure what we're trying to get out ahead of. And maybe what you're going to want to have the board make a decision on is, we will come up with a policy that's going to cover this within the next 12 months. Maybe that's all you can do right now. Or maybe it's pretty clear that for various reasons, and maybe legality might be one of them, that we do need to have at least a basic policy in advance now. So short answer to that question is, I don't know whether you need a policy related to AI, but what you really need to do is to test drive it first. Think about what the circumstances are where you might run into problems because you don't have a policy for AI, and then decide whether you need one.
All right, great points there, Aaron, especially with a topic that is definitely controversial in these times. So we just have a couple of comments in the chat that aren't necessarily questions, but I just wanted to share them with everyone because they are quite, I feel like people would find them quite useful. So we include a copy of our Competition Act policy embedded in the agenda of our board and committee meetings. Then conduct a verbal overview and seek questions during the meeting. Aaron, did you have any questions? Or sorry, not questions.
No, I think that's a really good. I think that's a really good point. If it's in the agenda and you recite it before every meeting, you've got much less chance that you're going to run into difficulties. And you also want to make sure that somebody in that meeting, whether it's the CEO or whether it's the chair of the meeting, that they've got their ears open to make sure that if we're going down a path that looks like it might be anti-competitive, to just shut down the conversation.
And then just a quick comment about a couple comments that are agreeing with you in regards to not attributing anything to any board member individually during meeting minutes.
Yeah, that's something we really want to be careful of. And it's not just that you want the directors' meetings to be a safe place where people can speak candidly, can ask what might be perceived as stupid questions. You want to make sure that they feel totally comfortable speaking up, of course, in a professional way and asking the right questions. That's one reason. Another reason is you don't know what the future is going to hold. And you don't want to be in a position where at some point in the future, your minutes are being scrutinized. And because some individual's name is in there, then they as an individual are getting scrutiny that is not reasonable for them individually to be getting scrutiny. And I've seen this happen, unfortunately. So that you want to be able to protect your directors and make sure that they're not ending up in an unpleasant situation, which is no fault of their own. Thank you very much for the questions, Kevin.
So we just have one more.
Oh, yeah.
So can you suggest which policies are crucial for local and state chapters of a national organization?
I'm just thinking out loud here. Does it make any difference in terms of the must-haves that we talked about? What are the must-haves that you really want to have, regardless of what kind of organization you have? I can't really think of any other policies that are a must-have because you're a national organization and you have local and state chapters, except for one. What I would really encourage you to have is a policy around how it works in terms of the relationship between the national and the local and the state or provincial chapters. Who has autonomy in terms of spending money, who has autonomy in terms of making decisions, who's in charge of what, how does all of that work? So I really encourage you to have a policy that says who's in charge of what, who's allowed to make the right decisions. And please keep in mind, when you're putting this together, keep in mind what's going on with your directors and officers insurance. Do you have directors and officers insurance, just one instance of directors and officers insurance for the entire organization, and that's expected to cover your local and your provincial or state chapters? Then make sure that whatever the requirements of that insurance are in the policies for how your local and your provincial or state organizations interact with a national organization. Any other questions, Kevin?
Nope, that's all the questions for right now.
Okay, wonderful. Well, we're right on time. We have our next webinar, our last webinar of the year is on December 6th, and we're going to be talking about how to effectively facilitate board and committee meetings. Next steps, Kevin will be following up with you, asking for your feedback, and I look forward to seeing you on December 6th.